Hi guys, I just want to do a few short review videos for you the night before. For those of you who have studied all of the information, it caught me, I'm checking my phone, and I just want to practice a little bit more before the test. If there was anything I would specifically point you to review, just based on the past few years' questions and things they haven't asked questions about, I would maybe point you to Second Great Awakening, which we did a lot of review at the review sessions for period 4, and how the market revolution and the triple revolution led into the Great Awakening. I'd point you to review the populist, which if you were in 2nd, 3rd, or 7th period, we did today in class. So if you're in 8th period, maybe talk to one of those people. And I would maybe review FDR. And again, if you're in 2nd, 3rd, or 7th period, we did that today in class. So if you're in 8th period, talk to them, about what we went over. So just a few reminders on the LEQ. If it says an extent, you must say the extent and a modifier. Great extent or lesser extent. And if it says fears, if it says causes, effects, plural, you must give 2 or more. If it says plural, they want you to give plural. They want you to give 2 or more for the thesis. So these are, I put these are released exams from 2015, 16, and 17. I put them on Classroom, I think, on Monday. So they've been there for you to look at. Just a reminder, at the top, the LEQ is only worth 15% of your grade, but at the top you get like these bullet points here that tell you what you're being graded on. It's basically your rubric. So use that. For the LEQ, remember there's no contextualization. It's thesis. Then your argument with evidence using specific examples. I think you need to get to hopefully at least 3 per paragraph. You get 2 points for this. 1 for giving evidence and 2 for supporting your argument with it. And then here, applying the specific thinking skills as directed by the question. Are you analyzing it as effects, if it asks for effects? Are you analyzing it as an extent? And again, that's more analysis and tying it back to your thesis. This is an older one when it was only synthesis. Now this last one would be the complex understanding. But notice there's no contextualization. So other than those 3 topics I gave you at the beginning, populist, FDR, and Second Great Awakening, here are 2 common questions. This is the year of the redesign, so it's interesting they both showed up. The 7 Years' War here, evaluate the extent to which the 7 Years' War marked a turning point in American relations with Great Britain, analyzing what changed and what stayed the same from the period before the war to the period after it. They don't give you dates. How you choose to define that period is up to you. Notice you have to analyze what changed and what stayed the same. Your thesis needs to mention both of those. It's just like the fears or the effects. Your thesis has to mention both of those to get the thesis point. The body of your essay has to address both of those to get now what the complex understanding point is. Here, evaluate the extent to which the Mexican-American War marked a turning point in the debate over slavery in the United States. Again, analyzing what changed and what stayed the same. If we have time, we'll come back to these. I would say both of these are to a great extent. I feel like we covered them extensively at the review session. And number 3 here, we covered this extensively in class when we reviewed period 5, so I feel like you guys are good on those. Pause here for okay, just a momentary interruption, but that's okay. We're back. I'm not going to go over these because, as I said, I feel like we went over these a lot at the review session and in class. These might be something you could practice. Number 2 has been in different ways, several different DBQs, several different LEQs, also short answer. So just, brainstorm the outside information. And the same thing with number 3, LEQs, DBQs, short answer. I want to flip over and look at, let's look at this one. It's a 2016 DBQ I posted. Again, you have the bulleted point rubric at the top. Notice this time they bold everything for you, easy to see. Use it as a checklist. And remember the synthesis point is now the complex understanding. Synthesis is one way you can get it, but not the only way. Okay, so let's look at number 2. Evaluate the extent to which the ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution marked a turning point in the extent of the United States politics and society. There's a couple things you have to do here. Remember, if it says extent, you have to give a modifier. And then down here where it says politics and society, you have to address both. In your thesis, do not say it was a great extent in both politics and society. You won't get the point. You have to, in your thesis, explain that it politically failed to reconstruct the South, and that, well, in the body you could follow up with that the North just, their interest in Reconstruction waned. Good word there. And then instead of saying society, you could say how it failed to integrate African Americans and freedmen into an integrated Southern society. Look at number 3 for a second. Evaluate the extent to which the United States participation in the First World War marked a turning point in the nation's role in world affairs. I've been hammering this since we did World War I, and we wrote the DBQ that, not this exact topic, but was related, right? The answer here, again, is it wasn't to a great extent. So both of these are not to great extent. So make sure you're critical when you look at those questions, that you're saying, that you aren't just saying, oh yeah, to a great extent, because you're not going to be able to prove that for either one of these questions. You are going to have a much higher rate of success if you say it wasn't a turning point, or it was not, like, to what extent, to no extent was it a turning point, or to very little extent. Okay, so let's just brain dump here for question number 2. Ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments. 14th Amendment, let's back up. 13th Amendment, during the Civil War, at the very tail end, freed slaves. But remember, the Dred Scott decision was said that slaves weren't citizens. So the 14th Amendment made them citizens, gave them citizenship and all of the protections of citizens. And then the 15th Amendment is then, after the right to vote is denied to them, gives them the right to vote. So you may be saying, wait a second, Ms. Blanchard, didn't the Voting Rights Act do it? There's your synthesis. There's your complex understanding. And that's the answer, right? It doesn't radically affect African Americans' lives, because 100 years later, you have to have the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that actually starts to enforce these. When you look at the NAACP cases in the 20th century, Brown v. Board of Education, they bring up the 14th Amendment and the right to protections of citizens over and over again. For this question, for the basic information, your outside information, you could talk about sharecropping, the cropland system in the South, the fact that most African Americans were sharecroppers on the plantations that they were slaves on before the war. We talked about labor contracts and how African Americans couldn't just say, you know what, I'm going to move to the North, thanks, and I'll see you. Right? They were legally bound and indentured to their plantation owners. You could talk about Jim Crow and, like, the segregation. You could talk about Plessy v. Ferguson. And, of course, you know the follow-up to that is Brown v. Board, but not for another 60 years. But you know Plessy v. Ferguson socially institutes a Jim Crow South of segregation and legal formal segregation. You could talk about the Ku Klux Klan socially keeping, intimidating African Americans and basically a domestic terrorist organization. You could talk about attempts by the federal government and the radical Republicans, there's a key term for you, to, with the Force Acts or the Anti-KKK Act, to keep the KKK down, but that it's unsuccessful. It doesn't, again, give you a time period. So you can kind of be a little bit, do you want to call it just Reconstruction, maybe to 19th century. You could take it up to the end of the 19th century. You could talk about Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington is not trying to get those grand political legal rights. He's just trying to, the cast down your bucket and lift yourselves up. He's just trying to get African Americans to work still in sharecropping, but prove their worth in society. Politically, you talk about the Reconstruction plans, the radical Republicans, but about the fact that the South does, here's a limited extent, does elect some African-American representatives during the Reconstruction era, but the North just gives up on their commitment to Reconstruction, goes on until 1877, that's 11 years after the war ends, and the North's getting caught up by the industrialization of the Gilded Age, and eventually agrees to the Compromise of 1877, and Hayes being elected, in return for Hayes being elected, agrees to end Reconstruction in the South, and the last states just enter, and there's really no more federal oversight of the South. If you look back in your notes, you should all have notes from the in-class debate we did back in probably October, where we debated this exact same question. You guys had primary sources. So look back to, I want to say, marking period 1. You all had class notes that you guys prepared for our in-class debate. Again, for number 3, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over it because we just did the DBQ, and then we went over the DBQ. But right, it's not the First World War, because we go back to being isolationist. We were only involved in World War I for 18 months. I don't even think it's the Second World War, because at the end of the Second World War, we could have gone back to being isolationists. We kind of joked, right? What's the answer to everything? Communism, right? It's the Cold War after the Second World War. We're kind of overlapping there at the end with Yalta and Potsdam. My phone's not trying to record me. That really ends Americans' policy of isolationism and makes us into an interventionist country. That's how you'd want to modify this question. If you want to talk about things from right around World War I, you could talk about how we weren't completely isolationist before. You have the Roosevelt corollary and big stick diplomacy, Taft's dollar diplomacy and investment in Latin American countries. And so we were involved in the Western Hemisphere. You can even point to the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century. At the end of the First World War, you have the failure of the League of Nations and the United States to ratify the treaty. We did the in-class debate on that, so you could check your notes and remember what we did for that. That was also a document, the Lodge's speech against the League of Nations and that DBQ. And then in the 1920s, we promote Republican prosperity and don't really pursue an activist foreign policy. If you look at everything we did in the 1920s, we talked briefly about the 4, 5, and 9 powers treaties. Don't bother to look them up. Just understand, you don't need to know the specifics, that they're attempts at us to prevent another war from happening, because we don't want to get involved in another war, so we want to help disarm Europe and create legal barriers that would prevent any one nation from growing too strong. You also had, I think it was one of the documents on that DBQ, the Washington Disarmament Conference. Again, you don't need to know a ton of the specifics, but just, again, it's another attempt to prevent wars from happening. That's how we're involved on a world stage. In class, remember, we did specifically discuss the Nye Commission. The Nye Commission was all about why did World War I happen and how do we prevent it from happening again. That's our policy in the 1920s. And then in the 1930s, we're just too poor to really do anything. That's when we give back to the Philippines because they're too expensive to administer. And I think that's a pretty thorough question to our answer to number 3. And let's just quickly look at number 2 and 3. This is from the 2017 exam. Evaluate the extent to which the market revolution marked a turning point in women's lives in the United States. And they even give you the dates here, 1800 to 1850. So the market revolution, part of the triple revolution. Again, for this one, I'd probably say to a small extent. Women worked in homes before the market revolution, and just really young women worked outside of the home in factories, like the Lowell Mills, outside information, after and during the market revolution. But that second cult of domesticity was going strong this whole time period. You have attempts like Seneca Falls, but women don't get the right to vote until, in state-by-state cases, in some states by 1870, but not in this time period. So they still, Seneca Falls, outside information, the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, outside information, is trying to get women basic political rights, but is met with some limited success. So I guess you could say it to a moderate extent. They had some advancements, but not everything that they were looking for in terms of political and social equality or economic equality. One of your key documents was Catherine Beecher's tract on domestic lives of women, and that women should be good homemakers and the whole idea of the separate spheres. Okay, I'm going to run out of time for this one, but the 19th Amendment, so 19th Amendment comes on the heels of World War I. Women get the right to vote, but do they? They don't. And the 1920s is all about modernity and tradition, and there's a lot of people who say women should return back to their traditional roles. Okay, I'm going to stop this now and post it. I may be back with another one on short answers.